hear about it all the time, don't you? And it's not such a big deal anymore, and we sort of understand a little bit about what it's about. And often we think, well, it's got something to do with evolution, and things change and genes change, and genes are, of course, little stretches of DNA. You know, DNA is that molecule that looks like this. It's like a long string that carries a message, and it sends instructions to the factories in the cell and how to make the proteins that make you up. So a gene is sort of like a little stretch of information or a sentence of information in the way that chemical is constructed. You see, DNA is not the information. The information rides on the DNA in the same way that ink and paper isn't information, but ink and paper can be the medium on which the information rides because of symbols that are put in a certain order. DNA is like a sequence of chemical letters in a chemical alphabet, and if it's constructed in one way, it spells out that you're going to be an alligator, in a different way an avocado tree, in a different way that you're going to be a human being. And not only that, but within limits, what sort of human being will you be? Very short, very tall, you know, brown eyes, blue eyes, those sorts of things. And we sort of get that, I'm sure. And we understand that when I say that it's equivalent to sort of, you know, written information in a way. In the same way as, you know, you can have information in many different forms. You can have it written on a book, you can have it on a computer hard drive, you can have it on a USB stick and things like this. So these are just different forms, but it's still, even in a book, you could count up the bits and bytes of information, and you could say this book contains so many megabytes of information. And in the human DNA, there's about 1,000 books, encyclopedia size worth of information. And why do I introduce that? Because you see, one of the key issues in the whole evolution debate is the fact that information specifies living things. And I've drawn a diagram here where I'm showing the DNA for a single-celled amoeba. That's a little organism that lives in a pond. We're supposed to have all evolved from something like that, and not just people, but horses and magnolia trees and all sorts of things have all evolved from that single-celled ancestor, supposedly. But here's the point I want to make. Even though the information for a little amoeba is about 200 books, but it's easier to represent it as one and then to show that there's a whole pile of books by comparison in a horse. So what I'm trying to point out with that diagram is that to go from that to that, you have to add a whole lot more information. Information that wasn't in the biosphere previously. You see, according to the evolutionary story, once upon a time there were living things, but there were no lungs, because lungs hadn't evolved yet, which means that the program, the recipe for how to make lungs, had not yet arisen. Then later on there was a time when there were lungs, but there were no wings yet. They came later because, you see, there was no information for wings anywhere in the biosphere. So can you see the point I'm trying to make? That to try and make that credible, you have to have some sort of a mechanism that explains how you can get this new information. You see, it's not enough to be able to point to some changes in living things going on. Living things change all the time. According to the Bible, the whole world is groaning in corruption to decay. And so, you know, it's changing, things are losing information, things are decaying, things are getting sick, there's mutations accumulating and so on. But the point is that even though in evolutionary theory information can go up and down, but over the net, over the whole big picture, from microbe to microbiologist, it's supposed to have had a massive increase. Not just any old information, but functional information, programs that are specific, that specify particular functions. So, you know, and here's what I want to point out, that the changes that we see, the examples of evolution happening, are all going in the wrong direction. Now, what do I mean by that? It doesn't mean that they don't fit the evolution model. Like I said, evolution can go up or down, but it means that it's not legitimate to explain to you that this is proof of evolution, when in fact what you need to do to make evolution credible is to point to examples of information increasing. And let me explain a little bit about natural selection and adaptation. When you hear words like that, that sounds very evolutionary, doesn't it? And if I say to you that adaptation is a fact and natural selection is a fact, you might think, isn't that all about evolution? I'm going to show you that they're just simple facts of life, but they're not adding any information. Let's start with just natural selection. Natural selection was actually not discovered by Darwin, in spite of what people think. Natural selection was first written about by a man called Edward Blythe, who was a Christian and a creationist. And in fact, Darwin took a copy of Blythe's paper on natural selection on board the Beagle, and he obviously leaned heavily on that in his own understanding. Now, I'm going to show you how you can get a change by natural selection, which is an adaptation, but it's actually losing information. And it's a very simplistic example, but it makes a point about selection, that selection culls things, gets rid of genes. You see, I'm going to use the example of hair length in dogs. And I'm going to make it a simplified example, but the point is valid, as anybody who knows a bit of biology would be able to confirm. You see, genes come in pairs, one from mum, one from dad, and I've drawn these as coming in two forms. One's a sort of a hairy form like this, and the other one is the short-haired form. Now, so I've imagined that there's only one pair of genes for the length of hair in dogs. There might be more, but that actually makes the point even more strongly. Now, because these dogs have inherited one each from each of their parents of each type, they're going to have a medium-length fur type. Now, let's say these dogs get together, and we know that every one of their offspring has to inherit one from mum and one from dad. That's how it works with all genes. You're going to see later that it's important that genes always come in pairs. It's actually a marvelous system that God has designed. Now, it doesn't take a genius to be able to work out that on average 1/4 of their kids are going to have the short-haired form from both parents, which means they won't look like their parents, they'll have short hair because they don't have any genes for long hair. On average, 1/2 of their kids get one each from mum and dad, a short-haired and a long-haired form, and so they look like mum and dad. And on average, 1/4 of their kids will inherit the long-haired form from each parent, so they might look like that. So imagine that there's all these puppies with all of this variety and running around, and in the winter things get colder. Let's say the climate starts to change. Instead of global warming, you've got global cooling, you've got a new ice age coming, and these dogs, the little puppies, which are the ones that are more likely to die during that cold winter? We're not talking about domestic dogs sitting in front of a hearth, even though they've got a collar, but just using this as an example. Now, obviously, it's the ones that don't have as much of the long-haired information, so they're more likely to be killed off. And in time, winter after winter, then it's going to be harder and harder for any dog to find any other dog that's got any short-haired genes at all. So eventually, by this dying off of the short-haired forms or the medium-haired forms, you're going to have the only dogs left will be those that have got the long-haired form. And when they get together, all of their offspring have got no choice but to look like mum and dad. And so what have you done? And first thing you've done, you've had a situation where you have evolved a new type of dog adapted to an environment change by natural selection. And you think, isn't that what evolution's all about? Well, that's what Darwinism's all about. That's not the key. The key is, could this be the sort of change that can turn microbes into mammoths and, all of these other things? Is it adding new programs? Well, the first thing to notice is that no new genes have arisen. The long-haired form was there all along. Second thing to notice that this is a permanent change. You can't send the change back the other way. Because what have you done? You've actually lost some information. You see, that's what natural selection does. It gets rid of genes. It's the same thing when a dog breeder decides that he wants, not mongrel dogs, but he wants nice, small, cute dogs to go on your lap. And so from a bunch of mongrel dogs, he'll pick the smallest and the cutest, and then from their offspring, he picks the smallest and the cutest until he's got something like a Chihuahua, and that's the sort of thing that happened in Europe over the last few hundred years. And, once you've done that, you've now got all of the genes for smallness and cuteness concentrated in that line in the same way as you had all the genes for long-hairedness concentrated in one group. You haven't killed dogs off, but you've ignored their genes along the way. Can you see that your breeder's choice is acting like the environment? It's actually saying that the dogs that are fittest to survive, and that word fit, by the way, often confuses people because it doesn't mean fitness like in a gym. It's not necessarily the biggest and the toughest, it's those that are most suited to survive. So it's really just a simple common sense statement of fact that creatures that are most likely to survive are most likely to have babies, therefore they're most likely to pass on their characteristics to their offspring. Very, very simple. But what you need to notice here is that when you've had this selection process generating all of these new varieties of dogs, and people think, wow, that looks sort of like evolution, Maybe you could even get new species like that. Absolutely. You could get new species, and new species have arisen. Because what's the man-made definition of a species? It's two creatures that can't freely and naturally interbreed. Now, I've never done the experiment, but perhaps Chihuahuas and Great Danes, if you turn them loose on an island, they'd have difficulty freely and naturally interbreeding. And so maybe they would earn the title of separate species. In fact, an evolutionist, professor of biology, University of Chicago, made that comment himself. And that's fine, but look what's happening. Every time you increase the number of varieties in this way, you're actually decreasing the variability. See, that original population might not have looked as much variety as it is now, but it actually has the potential to go into all sorts of different directions. So it's got a lot of variability. Whereas once you've got all of the smallness and cuteness genes, if you like, in the Chihuahua, you can't go back the other way. Even your common sense tells you that if you started with nothing but Chihuahuas, you could never breed a Great Dane. Can you see why? Because you've lost the information for the Great Daneness in the process of concentrating all these genes here. You've got no room for those. Same as with the long-haired and short-haired dog. The long-haired variety has no room on the chromosome for any short-haired information. It's all gone. It's been displaced by the maximization of the long-haired characteristic. So what am I saying? This is a process that's irreversible. You can't evolve back again to form, the original mongrel dog kind because you've lost information, and it's a process that leads to less variability and therefore less adaptability in each of these populations. You see, once you've got a long-haired form of dog with that previous example, if the climate changed again to be hot, you could never evolve back to that short-haired form again. And so therefore this is actually heading things closer to extinction. Can you see how gene pools are being narrowed? They're thinning out, whereas in evolutionary theory they're supposed to be expanding. I've engaged in a number of debates with evolutionary academics and biologists and so on, and all of the examples they give you of evolution happening is always, only, ever adaptation by natural selection, which is this sort of downhill change. And people say, well, what about mutations? Don't evolutionists use those to get the new information? Yes, they do. In evolutionary theory, that's the only ultimate source for totally new information. See, I'm not talking about two things hybridizing and combining their information. I'm talking about information that wasn't there in the biosphere before, brand new information. So mutation is simply an inherited copying mistake. When you pass on your DNA program, every now and again there's a typo, there's a glitch, and that glitch is then passed on, because when you make a copy of a defective copy, you're passing on the defect, aren't you? And then when there's another defect down the line, when you're copying, then that defect gets added to the original defect, unless something's removed that original defect. And so now you've got two defects, and then you've got three defects, and so on, and that's called mutational load or burden, an increasing load of mutations in populations of living things. Of course, natural selection can get rid of some of that by weeding out the damaging, harmful ones, but only if they're bad enough to kill you or stop you having babies. Do you see what I mean? So it's not going to get rid of the majority of them, because the majority of them are not like that, but they're still defects. They're not all bad for you. Sometimes a defect can be an advantage. Here's a defect, for example, it's called the TNR mutation in chickens. It actually stands for totally naked rooster. Seriously. This chicken has the information to make feathers has been corrupted or lost, so it can't produce feathers. It might be a good thing for Colonel Sanders or something, but not that good for the chicken. But in a similar way, let me show you how a defect can be an advantage. You see, if you're a beetle living on a windy island, and you have there's a mutation so that all of your offspring no longer have the ability to make wings, like this chicken doesn't have the ability to make feathers. Well, normally that would be a bad thing. If that happened to a beetle in Australia, the beetle couldn't fly fast enough to get out of the way of the beetle eaters, and the ones with wings would have an advantage, and natural selection would favour those. But guess what happens if that beetle is living on a small windy island out in the ocean? The beetles that can fly, they're the ones that have got problems, because they get blown into the sea and they drown. So natural selection works the other way, and it will favour those beetles that have got no wings. And Darwin actually, he noticed that. He didn't know about mutation, but he noticed that the beetles on windy islands all had little scars where their wings used to be. They didn't have any wings anymore. They couldn't fly. But can you see what's happened? You've got a mutation favoured by natural selection, great example of Darwinism, neo-Darwinism, but it's nothing to do with showing you how even a little bit of the complex engineering design information for insect flight could have arisen in the first place. It's actually showing you the opposite. And some of the world's leading evolutionists, like Professor Jerry Coyne, a very prominent anti-creationist, you ask him what the best evidence is for evolution happening today. He'll say blind fish in caves. That's what he's put in print. Blind fish in caves. It's the same thing. A defect that's favoured by natural selection, because the fish inside the caves, they don't need eyes, and they can't. Once they don't have any eyes, they've just got scars where their eyes used to be. That they're not likely to bump into the cave wall and damage their eyes and get infections in there, and all sorts of other reasons why they have a slight but significant advantage to the ones with eyes. But again, you've seen a defective form favoured by selection. By the way, it's interesting, if you take, some people say, well, maybe God created them with the scars and so on. But you know what? If you take two different types, two different populations of these blind fish, and you breed them together, what's happened, this has been done, some of them actually get the eyes back again. Because what's happened is there's two different mistakes. One mistake in one population, it sort of interrupts a different part of the assembly line, how to make eyes. And this one is another part of the assembly line that's damaged. And so if you breed them together, you can get one that doesn't have this mistake and one that doesn't have that mistake. It has no mistakes anymore, and so you've actually recovered, if you like, that eye information. Fascinating stuff. So what's the significance of mutations as far as the Bible is concerned? Well, Mutations are obviously things that cause a lot of sicknesses, a lot of diseases. They don't all. Some of them are only very mildly harmful. Many of them are like that. Sort of like rust spots on a car. If you've only got one or two, it's no big deal, but it's definitely no advantage. But the Bible talks about the curse, about the world groaning and corruption, the bondage of decay and all that sort of thing. And of course that can only happen after the fall. And then these mistakes start to accumulate. Why is that relevant? Because one of the big problems that people claim they have about the Bible is, where did Cain get his wife? Now, sadly, a lot of the time, I've known of people who've been fobbed off by Christians, just with a smart answer like, what are you interested in someone else's wife for? Or don't worry about that, just concentrate on Jesus and so on. But it's a really significant issue. In fact, there was even a big Hollywood movie that talked about, it was starring Jodie Foster. It was called Contact. It was about aliens, and she was the heroine, and she was an atheist. And she said she became an atheist because her pastor couldn't answer where Cain got his wife. Now, Hollywood wouldn't say that to millions of people, probably, if they didn't think that Christians don't have an answer. And sadly, many of us have given that impression, but the answer is really not that difficult. Well, first of all, what's the problem? Well, the Bible makes it clear that there couldn't have been any other people around. It was just Adam and Eve at the beginning. Adam is called the first man. And of course, Paul says in the book of Acts that, all of the nations came from that one man, Adam, one blood. And Eve is called the mother of all the living. And there's some very important theology involved there. You see, the Bible gives us an ancestry of Jesus all the way back to Adam. It says son of so-and-so, son of so-and-so, son of Abraham. Doesn't stop there, keeps going back. Son of Terah, son of Roy, son of so-and-so, all the way back to son of Adam, who is the son of God. And that's Jesus' ancestry. And those Genesis genealogies, I talked about them earlier. If the first Adam is a myth, if the timing of his ancestry is in doubt, it's no wonder people are turning away from the claims about the last Adam. Jesus and the New Testament writers clearly believed in Genesis as real history, but why did God do it that way? I mean, I don't presume to know the mind of God, but you are tempted to ask that question, aren't you? Because why didn't he create a batch of people so that you wouldn't have that problem of brothers and sisters having to intermarry? Because that's actually what has to happen, because otherwise you can't start the whole world from two people. Somebody has to do that. After that it's, nieces, nephews, whatever. Now, people say there's two problems there. First of all, when brother marries sister today, perish the thought, you would get massive deformities in the offspring. When I was in Cambodia giving a seminar, lots of people came in from the rural villages. People had become Christians because a church there was using the Bible to teach English, and that's how they came under the sound of the gospel. But they were confused about this issue, and one of the problems was that Pol Pot and his gang had killed off so many of the population of Cambodia that in many of these villages they didn't have enough people to marry, so they were starting to marry family members and so on, and they were seeing some of these horrible deformities coming out. And then they read their Bible and they think, well, how come those deformities didn't kill off human beings right from the very beginning? And then there's the other problem. I mean, the Bible says in Leviticus, to the Israelites, don't marry your half-sister, half-brother even, it's wrong, and so on. So there's those two problems. So what's the answer? Well, first of all, let me say why it's theologically important for God to have created Adam and Eve as the first two people and not Adam and a whole bunch of other people and so on. And also why I think he created Eve from Adam's side. Because in the book of Isaiah, talking about the coming Redeemer, it says this, and the Redeemer shall come to Zion, and unto them that turn from transgression in Jacob, saith the Lord. You see, that word that's used there, it's the only time it's used in the Bible except in relation to Boaz. Remember the story of Boaz and Ruth? And the word is goel, and it means the relative who saves, the kinsman redeemer. So Jesus literally entered history as one of Adam's helpless race, as the hymn says, to become our blood relative to save us. If we're not related to the first Adam by blood, we can't be saved by the sacrifice of Jesus Christ that the Bible calls the last Adam. You see, we're all related. You all marry relatives, whether you like it or not. If you're not marrying a relative, you're not marrying a human being. Isn't that right? Because we're all related through Adam and Eve, but we're not supposed to marry our close relatives. So what's the answer to this issue of Cain's wife? Well, the defects, where do they come from? First thing, I'll tackle the biological issue. The defects come from the fact that when you have close intermarriage today, you get a lot of hidden mistakes that come to the surface. What do I mean? Well, there's an ingenious system in the body that says that you get one gene of the pair. They always come in pairs. One gene from your mother, one gene from your father. So if you inherit a damaged set of instructions for a particular protein from one parent, it's okay because you've got the normal instructions from the other parent. It's like a backup copy. And it's great, isn't it? In this computer age, we can use that sort of jargon and everybody knows what you mean, you know. But if you have the same mistake at the same spot, say in the gene for how to make insulin, then you've got a problem because you don't have any more normal instructions. Does that make sense? And so normally you're marrying someone who they've got heaps of mistakes. Hate to tell you, you've got heaps of mistakes. We've all got these mistakes. Where do they come from? From the accumulation, generation after generation, from ancestral copying mistakes. But we don't normally show our mistakes, and neither do our kids, because the chances of these mistakes being the same ones are small. But if brother was to marry sister, you've now got a lot of the same mistakes coming together. And so you've got a very good chance of these. In fact, even half brother or half sister is a recipe for disaster. And that's why in most countries it's against the law, and it's certainly against the law in Leviticus and so on. And there's biblical support for that. You see, Abraham, even though he lived many centuries after the flood, which was many centuries after creation, he was still able to marry his half-sister Sarah, wasn't he? And there was no hint of any deformities in the offspring. The offspring was who? Isaac, the ancestor of our Lord Jesus Christ. So that wasn't some sort of a horrible union. And why didn't God condemn Abraham for breaking God's law? Well, Abraham didn't break God's law because that law came in hundreds of years later, at the time of Moses, when there'd been more generations for that to get worse and worse. So in a sense, in a fallen world, given the system that God chose, it was inevitable, in hindsight, that there would have to come a time for drawing a curtain to that. Now, I'm not talking child abuse, I'm talking lawful marriages before God. You see, it's sad when there's such straightforward answers that actually enhance the credibility of Scripture, that that the world has gotten the impression that we've got some impossible problem. By the way, in case you're thinking, does God change his way of looking at things, or does he change his love for us or his moral code or anything like that? Actually, no. A good analogy, I think, is if I'm a shepherd looking after sheep in a pasture. Now, let's say that there's not much danger around, and those sheep are pretty safe in that pasture, but there's one little spot of danger. It's over there. There's some cliffs, and if the sheep wander too close to those cliffs, they'll fall over and get killed. So because I care for the sheep, I make a law, a fence around that part that says, thou shalt not. Now, a short while later, maybe years later, times change, and now a family of dingoes moves into the area. And so times have changed. Now there's a new threat, a new danger, a new problem, and my love for the sheep is the same. But I make a new law, a new fence around the whole meadow, the whole paddock, whichever culture you come from. But by the way, Don't take my word for a lot of these things. One of the men that speaks for us at camps and conferences from time to time is one of the world's leading experts on genes and DNA. His name is yes, he's still allowed to call himself a professor, although he no longer works at Cornell University, a very famous university, John Sanford. He's a pioneer of gene engineering, and he's invented lots of things to do with gene engineering. And I'm talking about taking the DNA from one type of plant that makes a certain vitamin so that you can have rice crops that can make extra vitamins, and so people don't starve as much and crops grow better. And he's probably saved millions of people from starvation and with his inventions. And he certainly knows about genes and DNA, and through his research and his understanding and insights into these things, he's actually become a Christian. And he hasn't only become a Christian, he's become a six-day young earth Bible-believing recent creation a Christian. And he made a comment in an interview for our magazine. By the way, I made a mistake this morning when I talked about the magazine. I made an omission. I forgot to tell you that if you want that bonus, you have to tear off that little thing. I told you that, but I didn't tell you why. That you then take it to the checkout, and they'll give you that free issue. So I hope that didn't cause any confusion this morning. So what he said in an interview for Creation magazine, he said this: even with intense selection, evolution is going the wrong way toward extinction. This is the guy that has extensively modelled this Darwinian mechanism with others, with people who understand supercomputer modelling and so on. You can actually do this for yourself on the internet. It's called Mendel's Accountant. If anybody is of that sort of a bent and they want to play with that, you'll see that they've made it as fair as they possibly can to the Darwinian mechanism. He says the bottom line is that Darwinian theory fails on every level, and there's something else, because there's another reason why it became obvious to him that just in his own field of biology the world had to be young. Why is that? Because the speed at which these mutations are accumulating is now known to be so high that it boggles the mind. You know, friends, when I went to university, they taught us that on average every newborn baby was born with one new mutation. Now I reckon that's bad enough. You know, you have this nice newborn child and you think, poor kid, you got one more mistake than I have. And but in reality, it's now known that they were grossly underestimating the rate. Now about the lowest estimate you'll hear is 60. 100 is a low average, and it goes up to about 300 per person, per generation, on average. Now again, most of these are like the rust spots on your car, not a big deal on their own, but when you get thousands of rust spots accumulating all over your car, it's a big problem. You see, it can be shown that if populations of higher organisms had been around as populations for just 100,000 years, which is nothing in evolutionary terms, they would have been extinct already, because you would have reached what's called era catastrophe. This is a technical term to do with the integrity of a code that's transmitting information. It means that the code is no longer capable of transmitting meaningful information because you've had such an accumulation of errors. His book on this is out there, but I'll just quote from our magazine here. He says, all higher genomes are the whole package of DNA in any creature, must clearly degenerate. This is powerful evidence that life and mankind must be young. Basically, the message is we're doomed, and the only hope really is Jesus Christ, our ultimate life raft. In fact, it was interesting that a secular biologist called Lynch wrote a paper not long after Sanford came out with this, quite independently, and pointed out similar things, saying that, you know, he didn't take it to its logical conclusion, but he did say that if we don't start engineering human genes soon, we're going to go extinct. Humanity's going to go extinct. The book is called that, and that's out there on the tables. And he also gave a great layman's lecture at one of our super camps called The Mystery of Our Declining Genes. The whole issue of how we look at other people and the differences in people. It makes a huge difference whether we start from a biblical foundation. You know, the so-called races, one of the big questions that people have is, where did the other people come from? By the way, today, after these sessions this morning, I was speaking to a guy who actually goes on camps with a Christian organisation that takes young people on camps. And he deals with year 5 and 6 kids, and I was shocked to find out how these kids, according to this guy, just this lunchtime, he said these kids are overwhelmingly challenging the Bible on evolution at that age. That wasn't happening 5 years ago. You know, they're saying the Bible's been disproved, and, you know, scientists can measure millions of years, and they're asking questions like, how could the Bible be true if we have all these different coloured people, if we've got, you know, everybody going back to Adam and Eve and so on? Well, certainly in Darwin's day, he and his fellow evolutionists, particularly Ernst Haeckel in Germany, they believed there were these massive differences between human beings. And there was an incredible upsurge in scientific racism. Stephen Jay Gould, he said, you know, before Darwin there were scientific arguments for racism, but they just increased by orders of magnitude. He means 10, 100, 1,000-fold after this theory was published, because it gave people an excuse. Because you see, if we got our differences from being separately evolving for thousands and thousands of years, then of course you'd expect big differences. And because evolution has no fixed speed or direction, therefore you can say, well, maybe this group isn't as highly evolved or isn't as close to being human as that group. And Darwin was a gentle sort of guy. He opposed slavery and so on, didn't like to hurt people's feelings, but I tell you what, in his writings he saw the implications of his theory and he followed it, and he arranged people on a scale, and, you know, described the Australian Aborigine, for example, as being just one step above, you know, the orangutan or the gorilla and so on. And what should people have said back then? See, because a lot of people like today, they were bluffed by the science thing, you know, sort of, wow, they must know what they're talking about, so the Bible can't be 100% right. What should they have said? They should have said, hey, this book is the Word of God, and it tells us that we must all be astonishingly closely related. So that means they could have quite reasonably said, we'll just wait for a while because science is going to catch up with the Word of God. And guess what? Science has caught up. Because you see, back then, some mission societies even gave up evangelizing Aboriginals because they felt they were not evolved enough yet to understand the gospel. Really sad stuff. And the treatment of this is all documented in secular sources, and it's on our website too, how the treatment of our Australian Aboriginal people took a nosedive in 1860. There were atrocities and problems before then, because my book, One Human Family, that I'll talk about afterwards, it actually goes into pre-Darwinian racism, and in every case the underlying theme was a rejection of Genesis, because Genesis teaches that we must all be astonishingly closely related, because we all go back to Adam and Eve some 6,000 years ago, and even closer than that to Noah, his 3 sons and their wives, only 4,500 years ago. Well, modern biology now confirms that we are all astonishingly closely related. Do you know this was a totally unexpected finding in evolutionary circles? Now, evolutionary theory's been hastily rejigged. That's where a lot of this mitochondrial Eve and out of Africa stuff comes from, to take that information into account. But it wasn't the prediction of what they expected to find, but it was what Christians should have expected to find. Those 2 girls, for example, here's them when they were young, and people say, what about all the differences? How can we be astonishingly closely related if there's all these massive differences in colour and so on? Well, let me first tell you how closely related we are. You know, the DNA distance between any 2 groups of people on average is actually less than the potential difference between any two people within each group. What does that mean in practice? That I could take the two most different looking groups in the world, let's say that that's the Khoisan, they used to be called the Bushmen of the Kalahari, that film, The Gods Must Be Crazy, and say people from Norway, tall, blonde and whatever, couldn't look more different. And you could have a person chosen from that group at random and from that group at random, and the DNA distance between them could actually be less than the DNA distance between two Chinese people that look Chinese, but one of them as family for generations has spoken Hakka and the other one for generations has spoken Teochew, for example. And people are mind blown by that. When we look at the differences, those two little girls are actually twins. They had the same father and the same mother. Because you see, the apparent differences are only different combinations of the same stuff. It's very simple. It's a brown pigment called melanin. And what colour you are means what shade of brown you are depends upon the information for how much of that stuff gets pumped out in your skin. You see, if you have the information to pump out a lot of it in your skin, people might call you black, but take a closer look, you're actually dark brown. If people actually call me white, and I tell them my shirt's white, I'm not white. Can you see the difference? I'm actually light brown. All right, I'm actually a little bit pinkish. Why is that? Because I don't have enough of that sunscreen chemical melanin to stop the redness of my red blood cells from shining through. That's all it is. But what about the colour of the eyes? Isn't there a separately evolved chemical for blue eyes? No, there's not. It's the same stuff again. You have the information to pump out a lot of melanin in the iris of your eye, you'll have brown eyes. Information for just a little bit, you've got blue eyes. There's no blue paint in blue eyes. It's just an optical effect from the light scattering off that little bit of the brown stuff, melanin. And the same for the colour of your hair. Information for a lot of melanin in your hair, you have brown or black hair. Information for a little bit, you have blonde hair. There's no goldy chemical or anything like that. Just different combinations of the same stuff. And you can do the same for any characteristic. For instance, the eyes. We often say to people, what do you notice about this lady? And people say the pipe or the scars, but in actual fact, look at her eyes. She's from Africa, no Asian ancestry, yet her eyes wouldn't go astray in Japan or Korea. There's just different combinations of the same stuff. No group has got any distinct, uniquely evolved chemical. But what can we say from that? That blue-eyed blondes have less information? No. I can't say that. Not with the pastor's family sitting there and with the fact that I've got a blue-eyed blonde-haired daughter and so on. But what we can say is that Adam and Eve could not have been, as they're often depicted, blue eyes, blonde hair and pale skin, because then they wouldn't have had the information to give rise to all the people groups. You see, two brown-eyed people with the right mix of genes can give rise, like these parents did, to both blue-eyed and brown-eyed offspring, but two blue-eyed people can't generally give rise to brown-eyed offspring because they don't have the information. So that means Adam and Eve, from a colouring perspective, would have been middle of the road in everything. Brown eyes, brown hair, a brown skin like most of the world's population. Surprise, surprise. People are also surprised to find that kidney transplants and things can actually be quite successfully performed between totally different groups, like Australian Aborigines or European Australians, African Americans and European Americans. Sometimes the best match is found from someone from a different ethnic group, which is no surprise because we're all astonishingly closely related. But what would you need to have happen to have the sort of distribution and the sort of fixed characteristics that you have in some groups? For instance, if West Africans always marry each other, then all their kids look like West Africans. Whereas in other groups, in parts of South India, for instance, you can have all the different shades of a skin colour at the dining room table within the same related family. So what would you need to have? You'd need to have a situation like the Bible describes at Babel, where a large intermarrying population is suddenly broken up into several in-marrying, that can only marry each other. See, the Bible says that, it doesn't say that God said, I want to make races. That's not the purpose of what happened at Babel. It was because he said, these people are disobeying my commandment to spread out across the earth. And, God has a habit of, he's the boss. What he wants, he tends to get. Ask Jonah. Amen. And anyway, what happens is, of course, if there's sudden new languages created, a whole batch of them. By the way, if you look at Genesis carefully, it seems to indicate that the separation was along extended family lines. And that indicates that there probably would have been, maybe 20 or less, or if more, probably not many more, of these new languages created at Babel. Okay, one might have stayed the same, but all the rest had to be new, so that people couldn't understand each other anymore. Yes, God can create languages, he can create the vocabulary and so on. He had to do that with Adam and Eve at the beginning. And as a result, you have friction, you have hostility, people just begin to sort of go all over the place. And of course, they're not always going to take all the technology of their previous culture inside their head. I often say, if my extended family and I were forced to go out into the wilderness and begin again, well, we've got people like teachers and doctors and things like that who don't know how to find ore bodies or metal or make tools or anything like that. So we'd really have to go back to basics, and it's not difficult to forget things in a short time. And of course, that this was happening in the area of present-day Sumeria, the plain of Shinar, the Bible calls it. And so that's where people talk about the cradle of civilizations, where farming began, where this began, big, very civilized nations and cities and so on sprang up quite suddenly. But it's not the beginning of civilization, it's the re-beginning of civilization after the flood. So this breakup of languages is very important, because each group takes only a subset of the total gene pool. It's a bit like, one group might have, just by a random distribution, random in quote marks of course, more genes for darkness, for producing more of that stuff in the skin, others genes for producing not quite as much, others for much less, just to begin with. Now, natural selection can fine-tune those colours. It doesn't create the colours. So that if one group with more genes for darkness and one group with more genes for lightness heads off towards a sunlit area like equatorial Africa, well, the ones with the sunscreen chemical in their skin, more of it, are going to do better, not just because they won't get as much sunburn and skin cancer and eye cancer and so on, but because melanin has also been shown to protect against tropical skin diseases like yours. And it's also been shown to protect against the breakdown of the B vitamin, folic acid in the skin from ultraviolet light and so on. The opposite effect would work when you get into the poorly illuminated areas like in Scandinavia or Scotland, and that is that the group with the darker skin wouldn't do as well because they wouldn't get enough sunlight into their skin to make enough vitamin D for healthy bones and so on. So natural selection would tend, it wouldn't be a perfect distribution, but it would tend to result in darker skinned people in areas with more sun, and areas with less have much less of that stuff. By the way, it's believed that blue eyes are likely a mutation that arose early in human history, and that's people like Sanford and Dr. Rob Carter, our CMI expert on genes, who researches with Sanford and so on, would agree with that. That's where the evidence is pointing. But let's talk about Babel, and let's talk about languages, because there's often a misconception that if you believe the Bible, that you have to believe that all of the 600 or 700 languages of Papua New Guinea were created at Babel. and they all happen to come out here and begin to talk languages that when you look closely, many of them are obviously related. What do I mean when I say languages are related? Well, I'll give you some examples from 3 languages that I have some connection with. I obviously speak English. My first language was German, and so I speak German and English, and Dutch is sort of in between. It's definitely related, and you can show that by looking at lots of different words. For instance, the word for water, there it is in English, Dutch and German. Water, Water, Wasser in German. And in English it's dog or hound, for name for a dog. In Dutch it's Hond, in German it's Hund. For clock in English and Dutch it's Klok, and in German it's Uhr, which comes from the Latin hora. You could make a whole list of things like this, and there'd be no doubt in your mind that there's a connection between those 3 languages. Now, speaking both German and English, if I read modern day Dutch, I can decipher maybe 30 or 40% of it in writing. But when I went to Malacca in Malaysia and visited an old Dutch cemetery, hundreds of years old, I found that there's lots of stuff written on the tombstones in the old Dutch, and I found I could understand every word. Almost, maybe 98%, something like that. Because, see, what happens is language is changing. And it has a lot to do with separation. So you'll find that genes and gene patterns are connected to language patterns. That's why I talked before about, if a Chinese person, their family's always spoken this dialect, another one's spoken a different dialect, you'll find that the gene separation between them is going to be higher. Now, what am I saying with this? I'm saying that you can join those languages up together. And in fact, you can join together the Romance languages, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and so on, and French, and you can join them together. But then you can join those and the Germanic languages. And over there you can put Greek in there as well. That's related to these European languages. So is Russian, even though it seems enormously different. But it's definitely related. And then you join them all back, you can actually link them together with the ancient Indian language called Sanskrit. And that's called the Indo-European family of languages. Now, according to evolutionary speculation, yes, you should be able to join these up, and you can, but, by the way, not Finnish, Hungarian or Basque, and you should be able to join these up, the Hawaiian, Tagalog, Malay, Javanese, and so on, and there's the Sino-Asiatic language family, Chinese, Japanese, and so on. But you would also expect to be able to join all those up in turn until you had the base of the tree, which evolved from animal grunts. So there should be a primordial language, if you like. Whereas in Genesis history, you would not expect to be able to join them up. You'd expect to be able to join up each language family until it went back to one of those original Babel languages, like Proto-Indo-European and so on, which can actually, to an extent, be reconstructed. And sorry, I've got that little problem down there, but it just says language families of today. So here you'd expect one big tree with lots of diverging branches. Here you'd expect an orchard of separate trees. Some have diverged more than others. Why has Papua New Guinea got so many languages? Because there's lots of hills and valleys, and a tribe could be separated by just a mountain range, and for 100 or 200 years, and after that they can't understand each other anymore. In fact, I have trouble understanding Kiwi people at the airport in Auckland. I had a lady once say to me, "Have you had your bags tagged?" And I said, "What?" She said, "Tag your bags." "Ah, tag my bags, right." Okay. Anyway, so sorry if there's a Kiwi here. Just kidding. That connection at Babel that we all go back to, that when you think about it, there are predictions that come out of that. For instance, you would expect there to be some cultural memories, you know how we talked about dinosaurs, some cultural memories of the events of creation and the flood. Because you see, all of the people that survived the flood would have powerful memories of it, particularly in those early generations. So it's no surprise when you find astonishingly paralleled flood legends in hundreds of cultures around the world. There's one Aboriginal group in the 1920s. They were discovered in the Western Desert by anthropologists, not by missionaries. They'd had no contact with Christianity, civilization, whatever. And they had a story of the flood which went something like this. The Great Spirit got angry because people were tormenting Dumbi, the winking owl, and plucking his feathers. And so the Great Spirit got angry and decided to flood the whole world. And he told the hero, the Aboriginal Noah, different name of course, to build a big raft. And on the raft put all the animals, you know, the goanna and the cockatoo and the kangaroo and all that. And wife and family as an afterthought, and some food, and then the rest of the world was destroyed. The ark, the raft landed on a mountain, and the world was repopulated by the survivors of the raft. And the story ends with a rainbow, and you have, after that, the Aboriginal Noah kills a kangaroo and cooks it, and the smell goes into the nostrils of the Great Spirit, and he's pleased. Where'd they get that story from? If there hasn't been any connection between them and the Jews for the alleged 50,000 years, you know. It's not just flood legend. You know, you never find Aboriginal stories of Jonah and the whale, or Moses crossing the Red Sea, because that connection was broken at Babel. That's the point of divergence. Genesis history makes sense of reality. By the way, there are other indicators like that. Many things are lost in the mists of antiquity, but for instance, the names of some of the constellations. Now, I don't want to get too carried away with this. Some people, they take a point and they sort of, you know, take evidence from here and evidence from there and don't necessarily check everything carefully. So, but there are some constellations where it's really powerful stuff. For example, the Pleiades. Now, Pleiades are called the Seven Sisters. And the Greeks called them the Seven Sisters, and we call them the Seven Sisters. But that's not hard to understand, because the ancient Greeks, there's a cultural connection between ancient Greece and modern-day Europe and our Australian civilization and American and so on. That's easy to understand. But why have the Australian Aborigines, several of the tribes, why do they call it the Seven Sisters? And they have almost the identical story to the Greeks, if there's never been any meeting between ancient Greeks and Aborigines. You look up at the stars, there's nothing about them that suggests that they're sisters. In fact, they don't even look female, you know. So why should they be called that? Well, lots of things too, including the ancient Chinese writing. See, Chinese is different from our writing, a different type of writing altogether. Our writing has symbols that represent sounds. Theirs has pictures that represent concepts. That's why many people are surprised to find that if you go to Hong Kong and you have a Cantonese person who speaks Cantonese, and across the border in mainland China, somebody who speaks Mandarin, now ignoring the fact that you've now got simplified script and traditional script, but basic principle is correct. Or take a Taiwanese person who uses the same script as Hong Kong. They look at the word for dog, the symbol for dog. Now when they look at it, they're hearing a totally different word. One hears the Cantonese word for dog, the other one hears the Mandarin word for dog. But they can read the same writing, because that writing is expressing the concept dog. And that writing developed from what's called the ancient oracle bone writing. People used to put bones down to tell fortunes and so on. And, you know, there's so many seeming coincidences. Entire books have been written about the discovery of Genesis in the ancient Chinese language. Now, some of these, if it was only one or so, you could say, well, it could be a coincidence. For example, the Chinese character for boat consists of the symbol for a vessel and 8 mouths. Mouth means people. So why 8? You know, Noah's Ark, 8 people. Well, that could be a coincidence. But, you know, there's lots more. For example, in the old oracle bone writing, you have a tree inside a garden. It spells difficulty and trouble. What does it say in Genesis? A tree in the garden brings trouble. You have two trees, and by the way, and in modern writing, that means that means difficulty, trouble. In the old oracle bone writing, a serpent wrapped around two trees means negative, no, not. In fact, even in Japanese, which is related to this, you go and you look at the no smoking sign, no, don't smoke. You can see those two trees very, very clearly. Is that a coincidence? You could go on and on. The books God's promised to the Chinese has lots and lots of examples like that. And this one, Faith of Our Fathers, God in Ancient China, it shows how the worship in the first dynasty of China was incredibly similar, near identical to Old Testament worship and sacrifice system and so on, which is what you'd expect, because according to the Bible, people started with the knowledge of the one true God, and they degenerated. Paul in Romans chapter 1 talks about how people did not like to retain God in their knowledge, and they turned away from him and started worshipping, carved things and foolish things and so on. The evolutionary idea of how religion evolved is that people started worshipping spirits and rocks and trees, and then they developed lots of gods, and then they had less gods, and then less gods, and then one God, and then hopefully they think no gods. But if that was true, then as you dig down in any particular layer situation of civilizations, like in the ancient Near East, for instance, you should be digging down and finding more and more gods, shouldn't you? My friend, the late Dr. Clifford Wilson, a professional archaeologist, he said that's not what you find. You find the opposite. You find less and less gods, showing you how the Bible's account of this degeneration in people as they turned away from God makes more sense. Well, it's been a long day, and you guys have been a wonderful audience, and I want to sort of just talk about a few things to do with the materials to sort of follow this through. This is one of the several books I've written, but it's the one of the most recent, and it's the one I feel very passionate about, that I've poured myself into more than any other. And it's not just about our close relatedness, although it goes into all of that in detail, including a lot of biological detail, but also it's not politically correct, and it sort of grapples with things like indigenous issues and so on, because I've got a daughter who has devoted her life to helping Aboriginal people and so on, and as I said, the book is not politically correct, and it doesn't pretend that we can solve all the problems in the world by just pretending that we're all the same, because there are different outcomes, but those outcomes, the evidence shows, have an enormous lot to do with culture, and they also have to do with religion. This book I haven't mentioned yet. It's some sort of a glitch there, sorry. The Greatest Hoax on Earth. It's refuting Dawkins on evolution, and it's in response to Dawkins' book, The Greatest Show on Earth, The Evidence for Evolution, and that's written by that really brilliant scientist that we employ, Dr. Jonathan Sarfati, the chess player and so on. And that takes Dawkins apart point by point, and it's a very powerful book. This one is the newest book we've produced, and it's absolutely flying off the shelves. It's called Evolution's Achilles' Heels. Achilles was a Greek hero who was seemingly invincible, but he had one little fatal flaw. And if an arrow was to penetrate that fatal flaw in his heel, it would bring him undone. And of course, evolution doesn't have just one Achilles' heels, but quite a number, and it's often in those very areas where it's thought to be invincible. This is a book written by 9 PhD scientists, who, including Dr. Sanford, he's in the movie, and they take it apart in all of these areas, whether it's natural selection, the geologic record, the fossil record, radiometric dating, you name it, all of them experts in their particular field. And here's what a person wrote spontaneously to it. It's only been out for a matter of weeks. She says, it's a comprehensive strike against the evolutionary paradigm. yet in a precise and concisely written manner. I appreciate the patience with which the 9 PhD scientists explain the complex issues to the layperson while writing in a credible way as scientists and academics. I can't wait to see the documentary. Well, the documentary is on the verge of being released, and it's absolutely fantastic. It's 15 PhD scientists, brilliant computer graphics and everything, and we're launching it across Australia, including Canberra. So you'll get, if you sign up on our email newsletter, I hope you've already done that. If not, please do it afterwards. You'll get notification of when that's coming to Canberra on the big screen. So I've been given a whole bunch of questions, and so I guess it's time to have a question time. And by the way, I'll just take this lucky dip first, and if anybody wants to give me further bits of paper, I'm happy to collect them. And if you think of questions while I'm talking and you want to write them down, that's fine. And once I'm done with all my lucky dip, if time permits, then I'm happy to take questions from the floor. So I haven't looked at these. Okay, first question. Thank you, Pastor Kevin. Most of the idol worshippers believe there is a God. They believe there is a creator, but they believe there are multiple gods who created each one, like Earth, a galaxy. One created humans, one created nature, etc. How do we explain to them the God of the Bible is the only creator? Well, there's actually some experiences that you can draw on from groups like New Tribes Mission. And they decided that if you go to a new tribe and they found, and you start talking about Matthew, Mark and Luke, it makes no sense to people. You know, man hanging on a cross, what could it possibly mean? See, we need, this is a great question actually, because it gets to the subject of creation evangelism. Because you see, we often look at what Peter did in the book of Acts and we think, well, hang on a minute, that's what preaching the gospel is all about. Forget all this other stuff. Look at Peter. He just said, you know, Jesus Christ and him crucified, he's the one. You crucified him, repent, and they all repented. But we often forget who he was talking to. He was talking to Jews and proselytes who already knew and understood all of that background, big picture stuff, without which the gospel makes no sense. In other words, without the bad news, there's no reason to understand the good news. And when that method, which worked so well on the 3,000 that were baptized when Peter spoke in the book of Acts, when that method was tried on the Greeks who didn't have that background, what did they say? What foolishness is this? What's he babbling about? Remember what the scripture says? It's a stumbling block under the Hebrews, but it's foolishness to the Greeks, to the Gentiles. And our culture has changed in the methods of evangelism that work. Remember when the big evangelists used to come in the 1950s and get fantastic harvests in Australia? Our culture was more like the Greeks. Most people understood about right and wrong and sin and God. In fact, most non-Christians when I was a lad would send their kids to Sunday school. Does anybody here remember that? Yeah. And that changed dramatically. And in the 70s, when that same bunch of evangelists came back and sort of tried the same method, the result was a big flop by comparison. But when that same method was tried in Singapore, which had not yet adopted evolution in its curriculum, the response was like Australia in the 1950s. Because you see, it's not just, you know, to the Greeks it was foolishness because they didn't understand all that stuff. But it's not just that our culture doesn't understand it, it's been actively taught that it's wrong, that it's a fairy story. And it's a situation where even 5 and 6 year olds are saying now it can't be right. But not 5 and 6 year olds, year 5 and 6. But back to this about New Tribes. New Tribes Mission found that you needed to start right from the beginning. You needed to teach chronologically. It didn't have to be complex, but step by step by step. And there's a brilliant video that you can look at on YouTube, and it's called E-Tau. And it's put out by New Tribes Mission. Now, I can't spell it. It's EAW-TEOW, something like this. But you type in something similar to that and New Tribes Mission, you'll find it. And I think you'll even, the clip's even on our website, because it shows how at the end of that chronological teaching, people were hanging on basically just like in Scripture. What must I do to be saved? E tau is what their tribe says for absolute rejoicing. It's sort of like the closest to hallelujah, if you like. And you saw this mass conversion of the tribe, and they understood the gospel. Like I said at the beginning of today, Paul never appealed to the emotions of his hearers, but he reasoned with them from the Scriptures. And, even this so-called primitive group, you can reason with them. The gospel is intended to make sense. Yes, it has power, but it's not power in a vacuum. You don't preach the gospel in Albanian on the streets of Canberra or Queanbeyan, do you? Because you want the gospel to make sense. So what happened when Paul went to the Greeks at Mars Hill? He first made a cultural connection where they were at, and then he started expounding, and I'm sure we've only got a summary of his, I'm sure, much longer sermon. But look at what he spoke about. That God is the creator, that he made you, he made everything. He made all people from one man, Adam, and so on. So he laid the logical foundation for the gospel. So you need to consider seriously in such tribes teaching chronologically. Now, excuse me. One thing I didn't mention to do with new tribes is what you've pointed out is very powerful, because you've pointed out that they often believe in a whole sort of pantheon of gods or spirits, but if you dig deeply into their culture, almost always you will find that they believe in an overarching God, and he's often called the sky god or the one who made everything, but there's sort of no real relationship. There's no, that they can't really relate to that. We've forgotten about him. The connection's been lost a long time ago. Don Richardson was a missionary who wrote Peace Child, a very famous book, but he also wrote another one called Eternity in Their Hearts, which is about how people already had this background that if you could tap into it and you could talk about the sky god. For instance, if in approaching the Aboriginal people, if instead of saying, look, all of the stuff you're talking about, it's all rubbish, you know nothing, and here we've got the truth. What if we'd said to them, tell us your stories? And we'd heard about these stories of Noah and the flood, and there's a story up near Cooktown, amazingly similar to the Tower of Babel. We could have said, hang on, our ancestors wrote things down and our God gave it to them in a book and so on. Your ancestors, they told stories, and some of this has been mixed up a little bit, but look at that, you've got basically the same story. Do you think we would have got their attention a lot better? I guarantee it, having spoken to a lot of Aboriginal people. Okay, by the way, tragically, Don Richardson is a long ager, and so he doesn't see that this is evidence, the fact that these people all have these cultural memories. He thinks that it's somehow something that God separately implanted in their hearts, Okay, when you find meters in between the layers, if you believe in millions of and billions of years, would you expect to find more than meters in between? I'm not sure that I understand that. The issue is that if not so much that there's meters of sediment between the layers, because if there was meters of sediment, then that would be another layer. The issue is that where there's nowadays supposed to be the gap, whether that's because of the neo-catastrophist theory or whether it's because of the fact that if you trace those two layers, A and B, laterally you find another layer C in between them, which is supposed to represent millions of years, then instead of that contact line being all higgledy-piggledy, with millions of years of erosion and rivers and grooves and whatnot happening, it's in fact dead flat, which happens when one layer of sediment planes off the one underneath it as it's being laid. Perhaps talk to me afterwards if I haven't understood your question properly. I've heard people like Ian Juby state that the pre-flood world can be simulated to a limited extent in a hydroponic chamber. This can cause significant changes in animals such as snakes losing venom. Is there any evidence for this? Okay. Maybe a little bit of a mix-up here. I don't think that's Ian Juby, although I don't know him that well, but there is a man in America who's got quite a different name, calls himself a doctor. He doesn't actually have a doctorate degree except a correspondence degree in Bible, and has some really way-out ideas. And he claims to, for instance, that the pre-flood world, that there was a canopy of metallic hydrogen around it which made the sky look pink, and I cringe, I'm so sorry. I mean, I tried to be open-minded and look at it, but it was just so bad. It was made-up stuff, most of it, and he pretends that he's running an experiment where he's imitating the pressure in the pre-flood world, and says that, you know, it neutralizes the venom of snakes, and it causes, you know, tomatoes to give thousands and thousands of bits of fruit and so on. But when you actually ask for the evidence, we've had our scientists actually go and visit his museum in good faith in America and find that it's not the big creation museum in Kentucky I'm talking about, it's a different one down in Texas, and found that the little gadget up the front that was going bleep, bleep, and like a cathode ray oscilloscope, looking very scientific and making people think there was some sort of experiment going on, he eventually admitted that it wasn't connected to anything. And it was just going bleep, 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 and it's supposed to be like miracle water inside this chamber, and it's just, sorry, I'd forget about that if I were you. How can we see stars that are millions of light years away? Okay, a light year is a measure of distance. It isn't a measure of time. But it's easy to see why people think it's the same as a measure of time, because we know from experiment and Einstein's very well attested theories that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. That's the speed limit to the universe. And certainly light doesn't seem to be able to travel any faster than that. And from observations in deep space now, it seems that light's always travelled at that maximum speed. So if a light year is the distance that light can travel in 1 year at its present speed, which is very fast, about 300,000 kilometres per second. And so it's a very large distance, and these things like quasars and some of the distant galaxies are extremely far away. In fact, even our Milky Way galaxy, where we can measure its diameter just by simple methods that are very straightforward, like someone doing a triangulation, has a diameter of 100,000 light years. So according to that, it would take light 100,000 years to travel across the galaxy from one side to another. So people think, well, isn't that just a complete, utter, you know, we've got to surrender. We've got to say, well, how can the world possibly be 6,000 years old? God wouldn't create the light on its way to confuse us. And I agree with all that. But this is a slightly extended answer, because I need to lay the foundation. First of all, and there is an answer, first of all, I would not like to face God on Judgment Day and say, Lord, I didn't take your word seriously about how old things were. I didn't believe you when you said that people were there from the beginning of creation, all because I couldn't figure out how you would be smart enough to create a universe that was relatively young and at the same time relatively big. But the next step I'd like to make is that in Big Bang theory, there's the same problem essentially, a light travel time problem. And you say, how can that be? Because they've got billions of years. You know, Big Bang people assume it happened about 15 billion years ago. But they actually need much more than that, billions of years more. And I'll try and be very quick and very simple, but it's called the horizon problem. It's a well-known problem in Big Bang theory. Because you see, when you look out far enough, everything is at the same temperature. But how can that be? Because according to the Big Bang, it started off lots of different temperatures and so on. And there hasn't been enough time for all of those points to equalize. You see, light the speed of light is also the maximum speed at which heat can travel. And so to solve that problem and several of their other problems, they've come up with some exotic ideas. For instance, one guy proposed that the laws of physics were different. That's a common one. You got a problem with your theory, you just pretend things were different. And then you say you're still being very scientific. In fact, one of them, I think he was Brazilian, a cosmologist, he proposed that the speed of light was much, much faster in the past. Now the interesting thing is that at one stage in the past we supported the idea that the speed of light might have been a lot faster in the past, because there were observations in the 1930s and 40s that seemed to show it slowing down. Now we've found the flaw in that, and we've moved away from that because there's certain observations out in deep space that wouldn't work if the speed of light had changed. But here's the interesting thing. When the creationists proposed it, they said, oh, that's crazy, that's impossible, blah, blah, blah. But to solve their Big Bang horizon problem, no problem. So what's the more popular solution for them? It's called inflation. And it's like a miracle without a miracle worker. It says that at the beginning of the Big Bang, gravity reversed itself for no reason at all. And everything suddenly got pushed apart so fast it was actually moving faster than the speed of light. It's called a superluminal expansion. How can that be? Well, they get around that by saying that it's not actually the objects flying apart, it's the space in between the objects that's expanding. And strictly speaking, Einstein's theory does not forbid space from expanding faster than the speed of light. Okay, let's grant them that. What stops this massively fast expansion in the early history of the universe in this theory? Well, gravity flips back again for no known reason. But it's a way to solve the problem. Now, if they can solve their problem that way, then surely we're allowed to have some fairly exotic ideas too, especially in this world of where we know now that physics is a lot weirder than we used to think. Quantum mechanics is some real stuff, but completely blows the mind. You can have a photon of light passing through two slits at the same time, for example, and that's been experimentally attested. So we have in Scripture, this is a model, this is a man-made concept, okay? It has been put forward by Professor John Hartnett, who is right now being paid as a research scientist at the University of Adelaide. And put very simply, if the expansion of the universe is factual, and there's many different ways to interpret the redshift, expansion is only one of them, and I'm not talking about expanding from a little dot like a sanctified Big Bang idea, but simply a more compact universe in the past, and we have God stretching out the heavens at creation, which is what the Bible speaks about. Now that doesn't prove that that means expansion. It could just mean that he spreads the heavens out like a tent, or it could mean an expansion. So allow that to be a very fast expansion, this time with a miracle working God to do that, not like the inflationary thing with a miracle for no cause. And what happens is that you get massive effects upon time. You see, here's where it gets a little bit counterintuitive. We're not used to seeing time as a variable. To us, time is always running at the same speed. But Einstein's been telling us for decades, more than a century really, that time changes. It changes with speed, if the speeds get fast enough, and it changes with different parts of a gravity field. When you use your GPS, how does that work? It works because it's receiving time signals from little atomic clocks that are on satellites, and it compares the time delay. But if that didn't compensate for the fact that time is running differently on those satellites than it is here on Earth, only for one reason, that if you were to take those same atomic clocks and put them on Earth, send up another satellite, there'd now be a time difference between that satellite and the one on Earth, because the difference is they're in different parts of the gravity field. And that's predicted to be about 5 microseconds a year per kilometre, and that's exactly the difference that those clocks run. And if we didn't allow for that in our GPSs, our position would drift by 400 meters every hour. That's how real an effect it is. So that's what I'm trying to say. This is not made-up science. This is stuff that actually happens here on Earth. Now, when you've got the whole cosmos you're talking about, and you've got this sudden expansion, you've now got time doing some much more spectacular things than that. So, to put it very simply, we see things from our Earth perspective. Everything in Genesis is everything in the world, everything in the universe is 6,000 years old, but then you've got to ask, by what clocks? The answer is by Earth clocks, because everything in Genesis tells us that, evening and morning on a rotating Earth, correct? So therefore, if you were riding on that beam of light, you would actually have, by this model, the light not speeded up, because it thinks it's going in the same speed, the speed of light. But because the time is changed, it's massively stretched out. It's as if the light is speeding to us very, very fast. It would be like reaching Earth in just about 2 or 3 days from the beginning of creation. And to give you an idea of how this works, there's a little particle, I was telling somebody about that in the interval, called a mu meson. And these come in on cosmic rays, and they're travelling at close to the speed of light. Now, you can create mu mesons in certain, atom-smashing experiments and whatnot. They only last for a fraction of a second. That's their entire lifespan, whether that's in space or here or however. But how can they take centuries and centuries to get to us from outer space? How can they survive that long? The answer is that they are still only living for a fraction of a second. In their time frame, they're only experiencing a fraction of a second. But in our time frame, they're taking centuries and centuries to get to us. Do you see what I'm saying? You've probably heard that illustration of one of Einstein's theories, that if you had two twins and one of them left in a spaceship and travelled at, say 2/3 of the speed of light and so on, out, away from the Earth, and then turned around and came back, the person in the spaceship might think the journey's taken 6 months, and it has. That is the actual period of the journey, but the twin on Earth would have aged to be a very old man, in a nursing home or however, in that time, because time is running at a different rate. And people say, but isn't time constant? What about God's time? Isn't that the fixed time? Well, actually, God's outside of time. God created time. In the beginning, when he created the universe, he created space, matter, and time. They exist together. The Bible says he knows the end from the beginning. He's seen the future before it happens. There's a whole chapter on that in the Creation Answers book. There's a whole book on that called Starlight Time and the New Physics. Now here's a good question, and I hope I can answer it a bit more quickly. When and how did the Ice Age so-called come about? I love talking about this because it's an example of how a puzzling mystery can actually be solved by the biblical big picture. You see, there is huge evidence for an Ice Age. Pastor Kevin, you lived in the northwest of the United States, didn't you? And there was evidence for an Ice Age in that part of the world? Because the Ice Age, by the way, is a period in Earth history when there were these big sheets of ice sliding around. The ice didn't cover the whole Earth. These ice sheets were in the northern part of the globe and in the southern part of the globe. That's why you'll find that evidence in the South Island of New Zealand, for example. You'll find it in Tasmania and in the lower part of South Australia. You'll find it in Montana in the United States. And the evidence is overwhelming, but all of this evidence is on top of the billions of dead things laid down by water all over the earth. So therefore it had to be after the flood. Now you might say, what's a flood got to do with an ice age? You actually need the flood to explain the ice age. You might think, well, I can easily explain an ice age. Just, for some reason the sun could cool down. Yeah, that could happen. All right, let's do that. Let's turn the thermostat down at the sun so that the sun gets cooler and cooler. What will happen? You will never get an ice age. You might have the whole ocean freezing over, but that's not an ice age. An ice age means water out of the oceans up on the land as glaciers. So how does water get out of the oceans up on the land? What do you need? Energy, the sun, warmth. You need more evaporation. If you make things colder and colder, you get less evaporation. So how do you get warmer oceans? You know, I mean, if you have a hotter sun, well, then you're going to melt your ice as fast as it forms. You actually need two things for an ice age. You don't need colder winters. You've lived in Wyoming, you know that the winters are cold enough to sustain an ice sheet. But the summers are a little bit too warm. The ice sheet would melt back in the summer. So you need cooler winters, and you need to have warmer water because you need lots more evaporation. So what do you got at the end of the flood? Remember, you've had the fountains of the great deep breaking up all over the world. Lots of volcanic activity, lots of ash and volcanic gas and dust up there, and that's long been known to act as an aerosol, as a reflector of heat back into space. Do you remember when Krakatoa erupted in the 1800s? I mean, we weren't there, but reading about it, how the summers were cooler for 2 or 3 years across the globe from that one volcanic eruption. So you've got the mechanism. You see right throughout these sedimentary layers, lots of volcanic rock. So you've got the mechanism for ash and so on cooling the summers. So you don't need that much cooling. By the way, the ice never covered the middle parts of the globe. Okay, that's important to remember. But now how do you get the warmer water? Well, most of the water is coming from under the ground. Is it hotter down there or is it cooler down there? The answer is obvious. You know, just very simple climate modelling. You just take water that's 10 degrees warmer than today and you'll find the ice starts to form immediately. Because it's like, can you imagine like your bathtub when you've just run a bath of hot water and all the mirrors misted up? You know, if you've got the water hot, then you get a lot more evaporation. And of course that evaporation is going to have temperature differentials. You know, it's going to be cooling faster at the north and south ends of the globe than it is in the middle. And so this moisture will be drawn to the north and south ends of the globe and it'll come down as ice and snow. So these glaciers will pack up very, very quickly, build up very, very quickly. What happens in the rest of the world where it's not that cold? You get lots more rainfall. That's called a pluvial period. Has anyone heard of that in association with the Ice Age? You see, it's amazing how it can fit together because when you do remote sensing from the satellites, everybody agrees that the Sahara was once lush. My daughter and her husband had the privilege of being able to take an expedition into the Sahara just a couple of years ago. They went to Libya for a holiday 2 weeks before the revolution. Imagine a crazier place to have a holiday. Anyway, this guy said, "Oh, look, don't worry about this tour that I planned. I'll take you into the Sahara," and his Land Cruiser, and he did. And they found in this completely dry, arid, barren thing, they found rock carvings with hippopotamuses and crocodiles and wading birds and lush waterfalls and rivers depicted on these carvings, and everybody agrees. You can see where the old streams used to be. People agree that Central Australia used to be lush and tropical and so on. You know, you have, you go up to Lake Eyre in the north of South Australia, which is just a dry salt pan. There's nothing there vegetation-wise. You dig through the clay and you'll find there's rainforest plants, and they've even got mummified leaves, aren't even fossilised. And they've got like bits of fungus draped off the leaves looking almost fresh because it isn't actually that old. But you see, after this water cools down again, reaches a new equilibrium between the water and the atmosphere, what happens? Well, the rainfall goes to its current equilibrium situation. So Central Australia starts to get dry hundreds of years after the flood. But for hundreds of years, it takes about, according to this modelling, it takes about 200 years to reach glacial maximum. The ice lasts for about 500 years and then it melts back over about 200 years. And so we totally agree that there was an ice age. We've got a much better mechanism for it. It makes sense of remote sensing data of Central Australia being lush, the Sahara being lush, lots more rainfall in the central regions. And it's really very, very difficult to explain an ice age without a catastrophic interruption. Because you see, even if they were to come up with a way to warm the oceans, if it happened slowly over tens of thousands of years, then the oceans would also slowly give up their heat. So as the ice began to form, it would immediately begin to melt back. And there are other implications. You see, when you have all of this water out of the oceans up on the land, everybody agrees that the ocean level is going to be dramatically lower. And so people could walk across areas now that have got deep water in between. Everybody agrees that people walked from mainland Australia to Tasmania during the Ice Age. Everybody agrees that people walked from Europe into Asia across the Bering Straits during the Ice Age. Can you imagine? Because this would have happened straight after the flood. So, and by the way, the Babel dispersion was in the days of Peleg, about 200 years or so after the flood. So the Ice Age would have been, getting close to its maximum round about there, although you can't be that accurate with just models. Otherwise you might have to believe in global warming, But anyway, what I'm getting at is that the dispersion of people and animals around the globe would have been greatly facilitated by the lowered sea levels of the Ice Age. Whole chapter in, guess what? Creation Answers book about the Ice Age. Okay, I think I'm dropping all the questions I'm supposed to answer. Okay, this one says, recent marine death, mass fish death, birds died in large scale in South America. Is there biblical explanation of it? Look, there's lots of things happening all the time in this cursed, dying, fallen world, in the bondage to decay. The Bible, the Bible itself says if it told us everything even that Jesus taught about, there wouldn't be enough books in the world to record it all. So I don't think the Bible is going to detail all of the many catastrophes that have happened, and I think this relates to this one. Why do we not see dinosaurs walking the earth today? Because they're extinct. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be smart aleck, but lots of creatures are not walking the earth today that used to be extinct, that used to live, that are now extinct. Extinction is a sad thing, but it's part of that relentless downhill process. And there are lots of different causes, and they're not necessarily the same cause. This creature dies out because of this, or so. Nobody asks me to explain the extinction of the left-footed platypus duck or whatever it might be, but everybody seems to think that the dinosaurs are some sort of special case. And the reason is, in part at least, because according to long-age interpretations of the fossil record, there was an age of dinosaurs followed by an age of no dinosaurs. So from an evolutionary perspective, it's a big mystery. Hey, what happened? And so you've always had these big picture explanations. The most popular, at least in the lay mentality, in the lay imagination, is that a big dinosaur, an asteroid, wiped out the dinosaurs, and there's all sorts of problems with that idea. In fact, many evolutionists no longer believe that. Yes, there is a seeming crater on the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, and it's a big one, and it may well have been caused by an impact, although some geologists, including one with a definite anti-creationist bent, claims that it isn't even an impact crater. It's been misinterpreted. But the other problem is that the dating is all wrong. According to their geological dating, the timing of that impact that supposedly killed the dinosaurs is 300,000 years out of date for the extinction of the dinosaurs and so on. So what causes extinction? Changing climates, struggle for survival in a cursed fallen world, things dying, they started to die. Doesn't that sound like the biblical curse? Guess what's a factor in extinction today? In my lifetime, over 400 significant creatures have died out. And one big factor in that is human activity, isn't it? Overhunting, habitat destruction. Do you know that Australia used to have a megafauna? Maybe you didn't know this coming from Wyoming, but we used to have giant kangaroos. Well, there's some big ones outside my window this morning, but not quite that big. And giant wombats, the diprotodon, giant emus, giant kangaroos, and so on. So what happened? Well, most people believe that it was the result of overhunting by the indigenous people. Now, I'm not blaming the hunters, because if you're going out to catch a feed for your family, it makes sense to get the biggest hunk of meat that you can find. But that they do that because, you know, there's drawings and stories of when people hunted these and so on, and evidence in some of the bones in the caves with, you know, Aboriginal spearheads and so on in association with the bones. But why couldn't people have had a role in the extinction of at least some of the dinosaurs? You know, a Union Jack in the corner of Australian flag is a combination of 3 crosses: Scotland, England and Wales. It almost changed a while back, but the cross of England is the cross of St. George, and St. George became famous for killing a dragon in a lonely cave somewhere. Now maybe he wasn't a hero, maybe he was a conservationist's worst nightmare, knocking off the last of its kind in some lonely cave. Who knows? But at least knowing that people and dinosaurs did roam the earth at the same time at some point means that you can have that to add to your list of factors that could have caused the extinction of the dinosaurs. And remember, they may have all not become extinct from the same cause. This type from that cause, this type from that cause. By the way, the big picture theory that was popular before the impact theory became popular was that there was this group of plants that we know about that were once growing all around the world. You find them as fossils, but you don't find any living today. So the idea was that these plants might have had a natural fibre content, like laxative properties, and so quite seriously the teaching was that they died out from chronic constipation. You know, the herbivores, and then of course the carnivores couldn't eat enough herbivores and things like this. Nowadays, what's the most common belief? That it was mass volcanism, you know, like huge outpourings of lava, which I believe happened during the flood, so they didn't poison the world and so on. But in the Deccan traps and the Siberian traps, it's India and in Russia, you have these huge amounts of lava that if they poured out today, they would tend to poison the atmosphere. But the problem is, how then do you explain how come a lot of the animals that lived side by side with the dinosaurs didn't die out as well? So it is a bit of a puzzle. Okay, we've talked a lot, and I think I've covered all of these. Let me know if I haven't. If anybody has 1 or 2 quick ones, we're probably reaching an end, are we? Yep, so, I'm sorry, there. If Anglos and people from Southeast Asia both descended from Japheth after the Ark, then why aren't their languages related? Well, I don't know that they are both descended from that one particular son of Noah. It's difficult to pin down for certain. Some people try to do it on the basis of the names and name associations. You know, they say Gomer is Germany, and then someone else will say it's this and this. It does become difficult because, you know, names in antiquity morphed a lot and changed, and just because a name is pronounced in a roughly approximately the same way doesn't mean that that place name is necessarily where those people settled. Having said that, though, that remember that the Babel separation was well after the Ark. It was about 200 years after the flood. So by that time, all of those sons had quite a few descendants. And so the separation would have happened, and so it's quite possible that one group, which became the ancestor of one particular basic language at Babel, and another group a different language, and they took different sets of genes with them, but they still descended from one of those people that were on the ark. So probably there wasn't that much difference between each of the brothers on the ark, although we don't know. But the real sudden, if you like, differentiation happened because you all of a sudden had, groups that used to all freely intermarry. And so don't forget, because they were intermarrying, therefore the descendants of Shem would be intermarrying with the descendants of Japheth and with the descendants of Ham and so on. And by the way, I need to also mention something that's covered in detail in the One Human Family, the so-called curse on Ham. Unfortunately, in cultures where people they had economic incentives, like South of America and South of Africa, they had incentives to take advantage of the economics of black slavery, which was freely available. And it wasn't racism that drove slavery, because people have always enslaved people of other races, of any race, as far back as you can go. In fact, the white Eastern Europeans were so frequently enslaved that the name the Slavic people is related to that. The Marine hymn, the shores of Tripoli, that your pastor would be familiar with, was because the American government many, many years ago actually invaded the Barbary coast of North Africa, sending in the Marines in their infancy, because there was so much white slavery going on. So it just so happened that Africans were available. They were sold to Arab traders by their own people. And then you had a cheap source of labour. Slavery actually drove racism, and particularly in Christian cultures. Why? Now, don't misunderstand me here, because Christian cultures had more of a conscience, if you like, particularly biblically, self-consciously biblical cultures, and they had that one human family concept. Hey, we're all humans. You remember how the American Declaration of Independence said that we're all got inalienable rights because we're all created? So how come we're locking up this batch of people and putting them in chains and so on? So there's a pressure to have a justification for that. So this is why only in southern Africa and in the south of the antebellum south of the United States did you have this myth of the curse of Ham, which is that we all started off equal, one human family, but then some of us got zapped. When in actual fact you read the Bible closely, it's not Ham at all. It's Noah's grandson, Canaan, and look what happened to the Canaanites and all that sort of stuff. Whereas in Brazil, and this is fascinating, in Brazil they had black slavery as well, but it wasn't a biblical society, and so there was no need to justify the enslavement by inventing myths about the curse of Ham. And so not only did they not have the myth of the curse of Ham, or that invention, but they also didn't have as many problems with racism. There was no apartheid era, there was no Jim Crow laws and lynching and this sort of thing. So all of that's covered in One Human Family. I get carried away. Last question.
Very quickly, my understanding is with the geological layers, the time frames of those layers are based on the fossils, which can be carbon dated and so on. If the rate of decay of carbon versus another rate of isotopic, if you carbon date a particular fossil, it comes up with, carbon dating might come up with 3 billion years, and another rate of isotopic might come up with 500 million years. Is there a problem with the assumption of the rate of decay, or what would be the explanation?
Okay. First of all, some misconceptions, and they're common misconceptions, so I'm not having a go at you, and that is that the millions of years somehow come from radiometric dating. Radiometric dating is used to sort of put some window dressing in there, but that whole system, the Jurassic, the Triassic, all that stuff, with all of its millions of years, was in place before radioactivity was even discovered. So it's not correct to say that radiometric dating is the reason for the millions of years. But how, and when people say carbon dating, it's not just you, just about everybody who asks about carbon dating has the belief that carbon dating gives rise to dates of millions of years. But no expert in radiometric dating, if he thought that something was millions of years old, would ever send it for carbon dating, because carbon dating can't give you a date older than 100,000 years. If they thought that something was millions of years old, because radiocarbon, C14, has a very, very short half-life, 5,760 years approximately. And that means that if you started off with a lump of radiocarbon the size of the Earth, pure radiocarbon, if it was 1 million years old, you wouldn't be able to find one atom of carbon-14 anymore. In fact, radiocarbon dating is actually a creationist's best friend, as you'll see in a moment. Let me first of all explain a little bit about radiometric dating, because there are methods of radiometric dating which are used to give millions of years. For instance, uranium-lead, thorium-lead, potassium-argon, neodymium-samarium, and so on. And they're all basically, and I'll run through some slides I've got here, they're all, basically it's the same principle. It has one type of parent isotope which is unstable, and that's why it's radioactive, because it's tending to continually decay to a more stable thing. For instance, uranium eventually turns into lead through radium and thorium and all these polonium and all these intermediate stages. But it's like an hourglass, because that's believed to be going at this constant rate, tick, tick, tick. Therefore, you should be able to measure this and that and work out how long that whole thing is going. But a couple of things you need to know, and that is that there is no such thing as age that's being measured. These kids that this guy was telling me about today in years 5 and 6, they were saying, they got these machines that can measure age. But these machines don't measure age. They very, very carefully and accurately measure radioactive isotopes and tell you how much there is of each. But then there is a calculated age. And that calculated age can only be calculated with all sorts of built-in assumptions. For example, you need to assume that you know how much there was to begin with. You need to assume that you know how much of that there was to begin with. You need to assume that there's been no gain, that uranium hasn't been leached into the rock over those alleged millions of years. You need to know that the lead hasn't been leached in. You need to know that either of those haven't been leached out. And so in other words, there's been no loss. And all of these are quite reasonable, it seems. For instance, especially the one about the... I've messed up my slides. But yeah, the one about the rate being constant for all those millions of years. But there's a way to actually test those assumptions. You can actually take rocks of known age and date them by these methods to see if they work. And that's when you find out there's some really big problems with the assumptions. What do I mean, rocks of known age? Well, let me first explain that if I find this fossil, right, I don't send it off to a lab to get that radiometric dating, because mostly it won't have radiometric minerals in it, radioactive minerals. The stuff that comes out of a volcano usually has radioactive materials in it. And so what I'll do, I'll look for some lava that's flowed somewhere and formed basalt, or some volcanic ash that's in association with this, just above it, just below it, whatever, and then I'll date that. Now that system of radiometric dating that I've been describing, using different combinations of minerals, that's based upon the assumption that the clock starts ticking when the rock cools, not before. Like, in other words, however long it's been bubbling around in the volcano, because the parent and daughter elements are always going to be separated from each other, that has nothing to do with the calculated age. So if a rock erupted, a volcanic rock, 100 years ago, and you know that because it happened in historic times, then that's how old the rock is, and that's what the age should be. But this is what the results actually show. Oh, hang on, this is just a mix-up of mine here. In 1986, one of the eruptions of Mount St. Helens gave rise to a mineral dome called dacite. That rock was measured, the radioactive ages, in 1996, that's 10 years later, using potassium argon. That was sent to standard orthodox secular radiometric dating labs. The youngest age was 350,000 years. The oldest age was 2.8 million years. And yet the true age was 10 years. In the Journal of Geophysical Research, a secular journal, they published the results of rocks from volcano Hualalai in Hawaii that erupted about 200 years ago. So that's the true age of the rocks. The youngest date was 160 million years. The oldest date was 3.3 billion years. Now I put it to you that if that's the case for rocks of known age, then how can you trust it on rocks of unknown age? Also, when you have two different dating methods giving you radically different results, there's some problem going on. For example, I've talked earlier today about the Hawkesbury sandstone around New South Wales. Well, someone sent us a specimen, this specimen of sandstone, from the Bundanoon quarry, which is in that Hawkesbury sandstone. And here's a piece of fossil wood inside that. Now, clearly, the wood is the same age as the rock that encloses it. Would you agree? Now, the wood, the fossil, the Hawkesbury sandstone, is Triassic. That means it's about 230 million years old through their dating system. But we sent that for carbon dating. See, remember, the evolutionist wouldn't do that because anything over 100,000 years practically, and definitely over 1 million years impossibly, you won't have any radiocarbon left, so you won't get any age. You'll get an infinite age, they call it. So there's just no sensible result at all. In fact, the answer came back at 34,000 years. So which one's correct? We have a specimen in our offices of this actual drill core sample from the Queanbeyan coal mine, BHP mine in central Queensland. We got it because we heard they'd drilled a ventilation shaft and they'd broken into a layer of basalt, which they knew about. It's a well-known layer, supposed to be about 30 million years old. And they broke into a sort of a hollow chamber, probably a steam bubble in the lava, and found wood pieces. And that wood had been charred and burnt by the hot lava. And also there was a leaf impression on the lava. So clearly these trees are supposed to be about the same age as the lava that burnt them. Would you agree? And when you sent the basalt for radiometric dating, remember it's supposed to be 30 million years old, send it for potassium argon, came back at 45 million years. What's 15 million years between friends? And the wood came back at 44,000 to 45,000 years. You notice a trend. You notice that things that have been buried during the flood and specimens from the time of the flood are all showing you results in the tens of thousands of years. What's that? What does that come from? Well, actually, carbon dating, and I won't go into the specifics of it. It's not difficult, but you can read about it in the free chapter on the Answers book, or you can buy the Creation Answers book yourself. But it works on carbon that was once living. And so it has to do with the ratio of normal carbon to radioactive carbon, because it all goes around in the carbon cycle. You know, you're breathing and breathe out and all that sort of stuff. And a carbon date actually would give you the wrong date, and carbon dating is quite useful for, dating if a particular ship came from Captain Cook or not, and so on. But it'll give you the wrong date unless you take into account the fact that the Industrial Revolution happened. Because the Industrial Revolution changed the carbon balance in the atmosphere, because it dug up all of these fossil fuels and started pumping non-radioactive carbon into the atmosphere to change that ratio. Now, how did that fossil fuel get down there? From the flood burying lots of the pre-flood plants. So if you need to calibrate it on this end, you need to calibrate it on that end. So a creationist would actually expect the ages to be between about 25,000 and 50,000 radiocarbon years, even though the real age is 4,800 years, without calibration. Because why would a secular evolutionist do that sort of calibration? So this has got a practical meaning. If somebody comes to you and says, I've got a piece of wood that somebody gave me, found from Mount Ararat or something like this, and I've got a carbon date here for 4,800 years, be very suspicious, because it's probably a manufactured date, or it's nothing to do with Noah's Ark, because you would expect wood from Noah's Ark, even though it's 4,500 years old or so, to give you a radiocarbon date in the sort of range that we've seen. And by the way, I was speaking once at a small Anglican church in Pakenham, Victoria, and the minister got up first, and I didn't know he was going to say this. He said, I got interested in this subject because I used to be an exploration geologist. He said, one of my jobs was collecting specimens for the mining companies for radiometric dating. And he said, more often than not, they would say, no good, go and get us another one. He said, one day I thought to ask them, what do you mean no good? What's wrong with it? And they said, wrong date. Have you got it? Wrong date. How would they know? And it hit him like a bombshell. How would they know it's the wrong date unless they've got an idea in their mind of what it's supposed to be, roughly, unless it's in the right ballpark. Professor Morga from he's a professor of geology at the University of Wyoming. We seem to keep coming back to that. He said, in general, dates in the correct ballpark are assumed to be correct and are published, but those in disagreement with other data are seldom published, nor are discrepancies fully explained. So I'm not talking about a plot or any deliberate deception. It's just it's a mindset which sort of knows already what these dates are going to be roughly. You see, if somebody sends something for radiometric dating and it's from dinosaur rock with dinosaur fossils in it, and if it came back at 40 million years, they would say, no good, go and get another one, until they get the right date. Or they can actually recalculate those dates. There's all sorts of correction factors that can be built in if you know what the date's supposed to be. Why do they say it's the wrong date at 40 million years? Because it's already been determined that the last dinosaur died out 65 million years ago. It's an internally consistent, self-reinforcing, a monolithic system of thought. I thought I'd show you these forms that from the first lot of radiocarbon labs we sent to. And I've whited out one of the questions they asked, because I'll bring it in a moment for interest. They said collection date, that's fair enough. What date did you collect it? Sample mass, how many grams did you send us? Oh, actually I didn't white it out. Here it is. Anticipated age. What age do you want, You see, we tend to think of these dates like somebody measuring the voltage, or somebody measuring your blood pressure. Doctor doesn't ask you, what would you like, or what are you expecting, or something. Just you want to know, tell me what it is, doc, And so you'd expect this to be a blind thing, to be just, here's your sample, tell us the dates. Not how it is. I was speaking on this and showed this slide in New Zealand. And a man put up his hand and he said, I work at the University of Waikato Radiocarbon Dating Laboratory. And I thought, uh-oh, what's coming? And he said, you'll like our form even more, I'll send it to you. He was right. Look at this. Estimate age, basis of estimate. This one is sort of tell us what you want, tell us what the basis is for what you expect, tell us what the youngest is you'll accept, tell us what the oldest is you'll accept. Why would they need to know all that stuff? Anyway. Being a little bit sarcastic, I didn't mean to be, but I trust that our confidence is in the Word of God rather than man-made fallible methods. And that includes the fallible theories of creationists. Can I say that? Because what we're not about in this ministry is getting you to follow theories of people. Man-made models are good, they're useful for supplementing biblical information, but they're also fallible. Only one thing infallible is the Word of God. And to the extent where we can reinforce and encourage confidence in that biblical big picture. I hope you've seen we're not fussing about details. We're talking about really important things. The origin of death, the origin of sin, all those things. That's what it's all about. I have been blessed by being here. I've been blessed by the songs. I've been blessed by all you guys. And thank you for your attention. I appreciate it very much. All the best.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Wieland, for your time and for being with us, and the team that came, Andrew and your family, thank you for helping. So we'll go ahead and pray and dismiss. And can I just encourage you, if you want to buy anything off the book tables, you go down straight away and get what you want so that we're not holding them up. If they need to get home, we can get that done, and then we can talk after we purchase our books, okay? Father, we thank you for, again, the evening, and we're grateful for the goodness that you show us. We're grateful for the Word of God. Grateful that we can go to your book and trust it, trust every word of it. We know it's true. And whilst there may be many things that we don't understand completely because of our finite minds and our fallibility, Lord, we know that you have all things perfectly clear within your framework, within your plan. And God, you said that we can mind those things when we seek you with all of our hearts. And Father, I pray that you'd help us. Maybe someone tonight still a bit skeptical, maybe still questioning. Would you help them, Father, to set aside prejudice and with an honest and a pure heart to mind the truths of the Word of God on this subject. And Lord, for those of us who maybe already are convinced and just find a greater strength and a bit more information to work with, would you help us to not hoard that within ourselves and within our own hearts and minds. And again, not to be puffed up with it, but to use it that we might go out and win people to Jesus Christ. Now, Father, I pray for Dr. Wieland as he travels back home, that you give him safety, and I pray for your blessing on their ministry. And we ask these things in Jesus' name. For his sake, amen. Amen. All right, we're dismissed. Good night.